Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. I'm talking about a quote by Annamalai Swami. Now, he was a follower of Ramana Maharshi, and in his book called The Final Talks, he makes this quote: "Self has no birth, no death, no sufferings, and no problems." And let me just start off by saying, I agree. I'm not disputing this. This is actually much of what I would say. But I want to kind of review what it means, but at the same time mention that the context changes a little bit between them, or among them, I guess you would say. And so, let's start with birth and death. Birth and death fundamentally do not exist. When we're talking about what is, we are talking about also the standpoint of energy. And if you think about it in terms of energy, is energy born? No. Does energy die? No. In science, we have said energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Energy is never born, never dies. What changes is merely forms. Forms change. But you are not the form. You're not any form. But you can't be said to be other than all form. The self is, as I'd mentioned in the past, like gold. When you talk about a gold ring or gold spoon or whatever, it's gold. That's what the substance, the substratum is. And so when you're talking about self, the self has no death, has no birth, because death and birth does not exist for the substance, say energy, cannot be created or destroyed. And so from the standpoint of self, there's no birth, no death. It's because birth and death does not exist for that. Birth and death is what we assign to arbitrary beginning and endings of form. A form, we'll say a form starts at this point, ends at this point. We'll call it the birth and death of that form. And that's not what we're talking about when we're saying self has no birth, no death. Now, that is specifically pointing to what is not. It just doesn't exist. Now, when we're talking about no suffering, no sufferings, self has no sufferings. It's not denying that suffering exists. Suffering does indeed exist, and because there is nothing but the self, the suffering is not other than the self. But when you're saying has sufferings, what you're talking about is the mentally created misery and unhappiness that we inflict on ourselves. And that which realizes it is the self, that which is the self, being the self, means there's no suffering. Suffering ceases. That is why they say after enlightenment or self-realization, suffering ceases. Because when the self is realized, or enlightenment and awakening happens and the illusion of me shatters, suffering falls away. And so the no sufferings is not to say suffering never existed, like birth and death never existed from the standpoint of energy. But suffering is a form of energy that is created mentally and inflicted on one's own psyche, basically. And so that exists, but when the self is realized, the self is known, when what you are is self and you're not confused with being something other than self, and there's only the self, then there's no suffering. And so the context there is pointing at upon awakening, upon enlightenment, there's no suffering. The self, when being as the self, there's no suffering. So that's a contextual change. So you can't equate the same no as with birth and death. So when they say no birth, no death, no sufferings, the context shifted. No problems, similar to no sufferings. Problems are a mental judgment. It is a resisting and denying to reality, which is the self. It's a resisting and denying of self. And instead of saying this should not be and make it a problem, upon realization, awakening, enlightening, there's always an embracing of what is. There's an embracing of self. And so we don't make what is or the self a problem. And so after awakening, enlightenment, realization, problems fall away. And so that is what that phrase that not only Annamalai Swami and others have said, but that's the meaning behind it. And so I thought I'd talk about it because I just want to talk about the first half and the second half to have different contexts. The context is not the same. And so, we don't want to think about it as not being for the same reasons. Because no death, no birth, well, that's because in energy it's not created or destroyed, so it never existed. There never was death or birth. It's just the fiction of death and birth that was imagined. And it is that fiction that creates suffering and problems, because what suffering and problems do we most have ultimately is death of friends, family, and ultimately ourselves. And so, it is a different way of I think considering the two, because I think the context is important. And so that's all I was going to point out today is the contextual change. It's definitely a classic phrase that I agree with. And so the self has no birth, has no death, has no sufferings, and no problems. But if you have any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.